The White House is working hard to reassure Americans that we are not in a recession, and seems to be getting some help. Facebook recently fact-checked an economist for saying that a recession is 2 straight quarters of negative economic growth. Phil Magness says that's simply the textbook definition of recession, but Facebook threatened to cut his reach if he repeatedly shares, quote, false information. With us live is Phil Magness himself, Research and Education Director at the American Institute for Economic Research. Phil, it's great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Why do you call this Orwellian?
Well, it is an outright act of censorship premised on redefining a basic term from economics. We know from textbook economics almost everyone takes in college that a recession has a working definition, kind of a rule of thumb, of 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. And we just met that definition, but the White House got out ahead of it and tried to write that definition basically out of existence to discredit it because they wanted to tell a different story that's suitable for the election.
Usually we think of Orwellian as government overreach or extreme government overreach. In this case, you feel that the government is working with these fact-checkers to do this?
Well, it's certainly the case that the fact-checkers and Facebook that relies on the fact-checkers through a partnership are carrying water for the Biden administration. I mean, this is a term that it existed in the Wikipedia definition of a recession until about a week ago, and suddenly when the Biden administration started putting up talking points, it gets changed. It's something that was accepted in textbooks until a week ago, and suddenly the Biden administration challenges it, it gets changed.
I think even Wikipedia has changed the definition of definition, but that's a whole other
Exactly.
conversation we can have. It's incredible. The White House says that only the National Bureau of Economic Research can call a recession. Why is that an issue for you?
Well, the National Bureau of Economic Research publishes a very rigorous, methodical assessment of business cycles. They date business cycles from the beginning to the end of a recession. The problem with this, and it's not any fault of NBER, but the problem with this is they are a historical measure. They look at recessions retrospectively. They measure them looking back in time. It's often more than a year before they'll issue a ruling or a determination that a recession is underway. And yet what the Biden administration is trying to do is invoke the NBER standard and definition in real time, fully aware of, fully knowing that NBER will not rule for another year. And what this does is it buys them time, gets them past difficult election cycles and other political complications.
Can you tell me a little bit about how Nixon sought to redefine the word recession in the 1970s and how it worked out for him?
Absolutely. So this is almost a textbook repeat we're seeing right now of what happened in the Nixon administration. Because in November 1973, the United States went into a recession. It was right after an oil shock caused by a foreign war. This is the Arab oil embargo that was imposed in 1973. And it triggered a whole series of negative economic consequences. There was inflationary pressure, economic downturn, but it wasn't the only trigger. There were other structural issues at play. And what happened is Nixon gave his State of the Union address in 1974, and he declared that there will not be a recession in the United States of America in 1974. A few months later, they hit the 2-quarter mark of the conventional definition, and the news started reporting on it, said that we've hit a recession. Well, what did Nixon do? He dispatched his team of handlers and advisors and cabinet secretaries to go on television, go to the newspapers, and tell them that no, this was the wrong definition of a recession. We had not, in fact, met the NBER definition, even though it wouldn't be announced for another year.
Did it work back then? Do you think it's going to work this time?
Well, we all know that the 1974 recession was one of the more severe ones in the second half of the 20th century. The 70s has a reputation as a time of economic turmoil, in large part because of this event. So Nixon was being very wishful in his thinking, and he tried to spin the media, but the media was much more skeptical of him at the time. So they did call him out. They did challenge him on that. And when it became too obvious to deny, there was a general recognition that a recession had set in. Right now, I think we have, unfortunately, a much more compliant media that rather than scrutinizing power, rather than scrutinizing politicians, is taking a stance on one side of the argument, taking a stance in favor of the Biden administration. And unfortunately, that's simply the media culture we have today.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because obviously is the textbook definition. I don't think there are many people who'd argue with you on that. How about within the economic sciences space? Is there pressure to conform within that as well?
Well, I think there's an open discussion, and what really most economists do is they recognize there are multiple ways to understand and diagnose a recession. The reason why the two consecutive quarter standard has become very popular is because it's a very functional real-time rule. And in fact, when we look back since World War II, it has diagnosed, I think, 10 out of 10 of the most recent recessions pretty accurately. And the only one that is somewhat semi inaccurate on is a recession in the early 2000s that had two quarters that were non-consecutive. So it almost met the definition. So there's a little bit of gray area there, but people think it's a functional rule, and that's why it appears in almost every mainstream economic textbook. At the same time, economists do view the NBER as something of a historical retrospective gold standard because it is a rigorous measure, but we don't use it to make policy in real time. We use it to understand past events and try to learn from those past events. So the Biden administration, even though it's invoking the NBER standard, it's doing so very inappropriately and veering away from what the NBER intends that measure to be used for.
Phil Magness, thank you. AIER. Appreciate it, Phil. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you.